Well, good day, and welcome to our seminar on COVID-19, the pandemic, and its impact to diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Jonathan Cooper, and I will be your facilitator for today. I am a student in the MBA in Human Resources program for Bryan College, and this is for our seminar in Human Resources class. So, as you can see, we do have a very robust agenda. The things we're going to cover is, first of all, to define what diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DE&I are. Why is it important to the firm? What is the relationship to HR dimensions and outcomes? The COVID-19 pandemic, how it started, what it entailed, how did we get here? How is DEI affected by COVID-19? How to refocus on DE&I as we get ready to exit the pandemic in some hopeful future. Moving DE&I forward, what are the human resource implications? The recommendations for CEO and the C-suite executives, and for your reading material, all references used to support this document. So what is diversity and inclusion? So we can't take DE&I together as one stream of thought, but it is the synergistic effect of three completely separate items brought together to form not an initiative, not a program, but to form a culture. And so diversity includes, but it's not limited to, individuals that differ in race or ethnicity, social economic status, sexual orientation, age, gender, identity, veteran status, marital status, disability, mental ability, differences in the way one thinks or processes information, language, and religion. And certainly this list is not all inclusive, but the point is that diversity brings unique characteristics, personalities, behaviors, and qualities to the table so that the organization can benefit from it. And so with regard to equity, it's about the justice and fairness without partiality in the way a company handles its people business through policies, procedures, and the offerings or resources made available to those individuals, those diverse applicants, with regard to opportunities. It's a culture where we all really want to be a part. And so if I think about equity, it's literally how do I level the playing field so that regardless of what group I may represent or be represented by, I have equitable status within the company. And then finally, inclusion. It's the embracement or embracing the difference of people. It is taking our diverse population, our spectrum of individuals that come to work every day, and it ensures that every member has an opportunity to play a role on the team for the good of the organization. Considered this way, inclusion is really about taking a seat at a table and being offered that seat at the table. And as you speak, it's a willingness of everybody to hear the great ideas that you have to bring to the enterprise. So, DE&I, why is it important to the firm? Well, first of all, there are definite financial benefits. There are operational benefits. Companies that have robust DE&I and that have a healthy and inclusive culture generally are 19% higher with regard to innovation revenue. So in other words, they do well in market performance. 70% of these companies are more likely to capture new market shares. And so if you look at it this way, companies individuals or consumers are willing to leave a particular known company to go over to another area where an inclusive culture may tend to exist. 45% are more likely to improve their market share. 50% have more productive teams. Employee turnover is reduced, thereby saving money. Performance goals are met and exceeded, and employee morale and trust is higher. And we know this from Rosenkrantz in a 2021 publication, if you look at paragraphs 2 and 3. Sarah Dong of GRC Insights says that an exhaustive 2015 article by McKinsey & Company found that businesses who rank in the top quartile for financial and ethnic diversity are more likely to have financial returns above industry medians. In May of 2021, Dr. Shauna Waters, creates a value for the employee by specifying that a company with a healthy DE&I perspective creates an environment of belonging at work, which improves the employee experience and a company's effectiveness overall. In other words, through DE&I, it feels good to the employee. It is more about the experience of that employee at their place of employment that matters. Change the environment, and if it appears the value of DEI is diminished, it will incentivize employees to look elsewhere for that sense of belonging and inclusiveness. As she also says, Better Up research shows that fostering belonging can lead to a 50% lower risk of turnover. It's all about the connectedness, and it's so critical, especially in this time of the pandemic, when so many have been forced to virtual environments to work. And so the more connected and belonging that a person feels, the better they will turn out for the organization. Where DEI is concerned, it's not good to look at these three items in a synergistic effect without looking at it from the perspective of the relationship to HR dimensions and outcomes. DEI does indeed have an impact on employee motivation and how it's perceived, whether real or whether it's just simply a view from the employee seat. And so because DEI is part of the motivation enhancing HR practices and opportunity enhancing HR practices of an organization, we have to consider it in this model. And so Kai-Feng Jiang, David Lepak, Jia Hu, and Judith Beyer did a study in 2012 showing the connection between employee motivation and opportunity HR practices and its effect on employee motivation to the degree where we see a direct, non-inverse relationship that can be quantified statistically. In this figure, we see from their meta-analytical research titled How Does Human Resource Management Influence Organizational Outcomes, they're able to tie motivation and opportunity, of which DE&I are related to operational outcomes and financial outcomes. And so as we look at the chart real quick, or the graphic, one thing that I do want to point out are the red circled areas show not only positive numbers, means there's a direct relationship that's in direct alignment, so it's not inverse, it is proportional. But then the other piece is the magnitude of the values, showing that there is a strong relationship between motivation and enhancing HR policies and employee motivation, and the opportunities and employee motivation. Ultimately, if we follow either one of these two paths along through their numbers, we actually are able to see how the net impact is positive on operational outcome, and then further, how it is a net impact in a positive direction on the financial outcomes. So the inverse of this is if I were to take DEI and begin to diminish it, or it no longer is seen as a valued item by the enterprise, it will affect employee motivation. And as employee motivation goes down, so then do operational outcomes go down, as well as financial outcomes. And then one other tidbit of information is, because there is an inverse relationship between employee motivation and voluntary turnover, let DEI fall down in the eyes of the employees, motivation goes down, and because of this negative sign, we immediately see volunteer turnover begin to increase. And that is something that we definitely want to avoid. So the COVID pandemic. So in March 2020, the global pandemic was declared by the World Health Organization. And so when this occurred, it disrupted the global economy, it disrupted companies, the anything else other than safety and survivability in the market took a back seat. And so in 2021, Catherine Bassel of CNN Business said, the pandemic has forced a large segment of the global workforce to go through a remote work experiment on a scale never seen before. Teleworking, remote work, hybrid work is not a new concept to the industry. However, it is a new concept with regard to the acuteness of or quickness of how fast we had to mobilize, considering the volume of workers that suddenly found themselves working from home, working remotely, having to literally mobilize their entire lifestyle in a period of 30 days or less. And so now move all employees, most employees to the home, getting settled in, children now displaced in school, we can now begin to see how COVID-19 and the pandemic begin to affect companies and their ability to perform in their markets. And so as a result, as an executive leader, what ends up happening is now I have to strategize and prioritize what are the things that are most important for me to focus on concerning my enterprise. And what happens where DEI is concerned is if DEI was on the top of the radar for some, it did suddenly fall to a back seat, took a back burner space. The COVID-19 pandemic and executive orders to shelter in place had rearranged the operations agendas for many executive leaders. So here's a fact concerning women in the workplace. Francesca Lagerberg of Grant Thornton International in 2021 said, after the increased drive towards diversity and inclusion from businesses in recent years, for some, COVID-19 put the brakes on. So in other words, companies that were talking about DEI prior to the pandemic, they were on a slow ramp up in a sense in some respects. If you look at some of the data for DEI prior to the year of 2020. As a matter of fact, between 2018 and 2020, some of the research that I've seen actually shows that there was a steady ramp up. It wasn't accelerated, but it still showed a rise and incline. And then the minute the pandemic was declared, all DEI was essentially out the window, at least within the first few months of 2020. The goal was to keep employees safe and to make sure to mobilize everybody to the point where they could keep working or invoke safety protocols for those that could not work or remote work from home, where they would be kept safe in their normal work routine. Okay. Many corporations immediately began remote working, and so safety and flexibility were the priorities of the company, according to Ellen Group et al. In 2020. And after declaration of the pandemic, the unemployment rate goes up. Due to involuntary reductions in force, companies began to lighten their financial burden, quite frankly, because revenues began to go down. And so to compensate for the revenues going down, they had to do something. So therefore, furloughs, terminations were a part of the strategy. But there were even parents who were voluntarily willing to leave the workforce simply because they had to prioritize their children's schooling over work. And guess what? If the entire population of the workforce is impacted and it begins to draw down and diminish from being employed, then that means those that are in the underrepresented groups of which represent DE&I, that population also dwindled down as well. And finally, one of the things I wanted to bring about from some facts with regard to the research performed. Women are highly concentrated in sectors that are expected to suffer high rates of unemployment in 2020. 1.6 million fewer mothers were in the workforce in the third and fourth quarter of 2020 than was forecasted going through the pandemic. There was an immediate surge of women that were unemployed compared to men. The gap was 20% in April. Now, we do see this gap begin to diminish down. So when you look backwards into 2020, by the time we get to about the third quarter of the calendar year, that differential had dropped down to 3.61%. 53% of the U.S. adult black population was employed, compared with 57% of the corresponding white population. 39% of jobs held by black workers were made vulnerable because of the COVID-19 crisis, compared with 34% for white workers. Vulnerable jobs are subject to furloughs, layoffs, or being rendered unproductive. U.S. mothers with young children have reduced their work hours at a rate that is 4 to 5 times higher than fathers that took on child care. And finally, Kirsten Ferguson of Forbes references additional research performed by McKinsey. This research showed that the pandemic simply amplified what was already a fragile situation. Prior to the pandemic and while still managing through it, these are some of the findings. Of those surveyed by McKinsey, there was a lack of employee awareness of DE&I programs, roughly 26% of the participants. Financial incentives were not aligned with DE&I goals, 25% of those surveyed by McKinsey. Insufficient leadership role modeling, 25% of the participants. And then finally, 23% of the respondents said that they were being stretched too thin to be able to take on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Ferguson says new research reveals that 9 out of 10 executives are finding it hard to execute their diversity and inclusion strategies, and that 1 in 6 people from underrepresented groups such as women, people of color, LGBTQ+, and parents who are still working felt more supported by their employers now than in pre-COVID times. What are you saying? What I'm saying is, as we transition to this next slide, that DE&I has effectively was not as effective prior to the pandemic, and the pandemic just simply amplified any weaknesses or gaps within those programs. And so, because we started putting safety first, leaders were not entertaining the idea of uplifting DE&I en masse. You still had a few that maintained the focus, but overall did not happen pretty much nationally and globally. Furloughs failed to accurately meet measures because of COVID-19, continued hiring freezes, a failure to elevate DE&I as an important business agenda or business strategy. All of it suffered because of the pandemic. This according to MBS Intelligence. The pandemic in and of itself was not the cause. The failure was to have a strategy that adapted to market or socioeconomic changes, and that's what caused many companies to lose focus. Their strategy just quite simply wasn't strong enough to survive the immediate hit of the pandemic. Employees sought more ways to support in the way of equity, inclusion, and connectedness, and psychological as well as physical safety. But along with this, DEI should have been woven into that plan. Here we are, almost 2 years, 4 months away from being 2 years in the pandemic. Corporations have adjusted. Workforces have finally landed in some place of stability. We're pulsing our organizations to see how our employees are engaging. We're trying to make sure that psychological safety is very prevalent. We're trying to make sure that we're taking care of our employees as they remote work and still trying to do their roles in order to keep companies moving forward. But how do we refocus on DE&I? Because it's taken a back seat, it's imperative that companies realize organizations that prioritize people over business outcomes will have brighter and longer term futures. This by Chikara and Michael in 2020. In 2021, Refinitiv provides a key factor as to why the companies must strongly consider their DEI platform. They state, and I quote, "The pandemic has reshaped worker expectations for both prospective employees and current staff." And they also quote that an analysis shows that worker satisfaction is essential to business success. In other words, we have to make DE&I a business priority. Why? Not only because it drives innovation, not only because it has a positive or can have a negative impact on the financial and operational outcomes, but one of the biggest reasons why we must make it a focus and refocused area is because now potential new and highly performing candidates are in the driver's seat from a talent acquisition perspective. And what I'm saying is that it's no longer about, hey, come to my company because we're the greatest in the market. Individuals are now paying very much attention to DE&I, and those that do not have a strong DE&I culture, they will find themselves in the last place with regard to the best talent that's out there in the market to have. And so a refocus on DEI should not take place because of the George Floyd murder in May 2020, nor should it take place because of the Asian American attacks that occurred in Q1 of 2021. If DE&I is a focus because of these events, that means the culture improvements only happen when it's tied to a major national or global happening that affects members of an underrepresented group. DE&I and culture improvement must be proactive with a forward-looking strategy. Otherwise, any actions that come as a result of a social event will simply be reactive and not sincere, and that will then fuel unwanted turnover of innovative, high-performing employees. There is hope on the horizon for the end of the pandemic. Regardless of when that time comes, company executives must restart and push forward DE&I. Acceleration is needed if firms hope to attract and retain diverse individuals who can bring innovative ideas to the company so they thrive in a new business environment. It is now time, not when the pandemic is over, but it is now time for leaders to dust off any existing DEI plans, revise them to make them relevant to today's market, and put into place actions necessary to transform the culture while making plans to return to work. So moving DE&I forward, human resource implications. So number one, HR has to be woven into any and all plans with regard to DE&I. If the DE&I function does not rest within human resources and may rest within the chief diversity office, HR is certainly to be a major player and partner within this area. So we have to create strategies where there are none, or we have to bolster existing strategies so the company's basically culture can become more inclusive and equitable. You must assess where you are today in order to determine where you have to go tomorrow. To the extent possible, DEI must be a part of every discussion where HR, the Chief Diversity Office, or a DE&I professional is concerned. It must be an agenda topic in every strategic leadership meeting. It must elevate itself to the enterprise leaders, and it must involve the adoption of the CEO, him or herself, and every other C-suite leader. Talent acquisition has to consider its recruiting strategies. We must consider that the ponds that we're fishing in, they look different now. We have to realize that a failure to change our policies or our approach to talent acquisition will mean the loss of potential and innovative talent. We're now in a digital remote work environment, and because of that, many walls have come down. Relocations are no longer a priority, and so therefore it means we're all competing for the same talented human resources. Inclusivity and equity is paramount to the success of a company. No matter how diverse the population is, a failure to create an inclusive environment where all employees have an equal voice and have equity is going to fail. No matter how diverse your population is, if we're not elevating individuals that may look different or think different than us into leadership roles, if we're not willing to invest in them, to qualify them, to build up their skills and abilities, to represent the communities in which we serve, company performance will ultimately stagnate, and then it will begin to decline as new competitors come into the market and begin to take away that particular market share. So here are some recommendations for the CEO and the C-suite executives. Number one, the most senior level executive leadership team should secure a consultant. In other words, a company of any size, especially if it's a major company that has more than probably 500 employees, should not try to do this on their own. They should seek out a consultant with proven and demonstrated results in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, spend the money so that they can bring on somebody that's an expert in this field. By doing so, it does two things. Number one, it creates a partnership where they're not sailing in this wide and vast ocean of DEI alone. But number two, what it does is it provides independent thought and an independent perspective so that a company that has been in the market for a long time does not become paralyzed by looking at how it used to do business and thinking that is the standard. The consultant can bring along benchmark information to show what good and even great looks like in this area. Number two, as a direct report to the executive leadership team, a DE&I steering team should be created. The goal of the steering team, quite frankly, for its existence, is to do more of the executable actions, to be the pulse of the organization, so that as the C-suite executives are creating strategy and have a vision, the DE&I steering team can then reach lower into the organization and truly be more hands-on with regard to the way that the business is going to transform in this area. Decisions through the team will stand unless there are overarching concerns by the executive leaders, but they should have pretty much autonomy to move forward. And so for that reason, I'm not saying that a DE&I steering team should be all senior leaders, if you will, somewhat in the director or senior manager roles, but they must be leaders that are, one, trusted, they must be respected in their spaces, and number two, they must be able to make decisions without having to bring every decision back to the C-suite executives for reconciliation and resolution. Number three, The DEI steering team will create a 5-year strategy to action plan that will utilize change management and communication plans. This is going to help fuel adoption and acceptance by the general workforce. If you try to do DEI in a vacuum and then you try to push it down, it will fail. It is always important to bring the organization and all stakeholders along for the ride. Always make sure that you have their voice in their ear. This should help to shape our strategy. The strategy will require financial resources and human capital to be made available, and this way it produces some tangible outcomes by the workforce. This provides proof that the leadership is indeed invested. It is the putting my money where my mouth is scenario. And so by putting this investment of time, financial resources, and people into it, it means that I'm definitely serious about putting DEI further along within the corporation. And so the firm should hope to see positive engagement by the workforce. And final recommendations, number 4, you got to execute the strategy. So a vision or a idea without being able to execute is simply a dream. And so we don't want this to be a dream. We want this to be something tangible for the workforce. So the strategy should come together and establish measures to show progress over a 3-year period. Monthly reports with visible scorecards should be made available. There must be transparency in this area. The whole workforce should see where the company stands from a DE&I perspective, and they should be able to note movement in a very simplistic manner, either on published on paper or digital reports. More formalized reports can be created for strategic business discussions with senior executive leaders and the board of directors, things that kind of synthesize the very granular data and creates the story and the insight. But at the end of the day, after the synthesization is performed, the DE&I steering team will then present this information during some meetings along with current pulse of the organization. The steering team will provide additional insights based on this info so that the market information relative to diversity and inclusion is made available very clearly, very concise, so that decisions can be made by the board of directors. The goal is to inform company leadership as to the trajectory of where the enterprise is headed. It's no longer about looking backwards, it's about looking forward. And then the final recommendation, there should be an annual fiscal review cycle that analyzes DE&I with respect to effectiveness and cost so that budgets can be adjusted. To elevate DEI and to do this right, it will take financial resources. But you don't just want to borrow and carve out. You want to create a budget that literally reflects where you want DE&I to grow. This should include, but it's not limited to, the DEI program elements. So in other words, some of the more administrative pieces from a technology and innovation perspective, office materials, communication, any digital products, any drafting or creative services, marketing items, all of these must be taken into account. The costs required to elevate DE&I and implement the efforts to appropriately change HR policies and procedures. It will take manpower to get this done. If your existing HR staff is insufficient, it would be good to reach outside and look at third-party companies that may be able to assist in this area. We must also look at annual costs associated with consultant support. This is a living, breathing thing. DE&I must not be seen as a project with a beginning and an end date. Because it is a living, breathing element of company performance and well-being, what we need to look at is, over the course of years, maybe a 3 to 5 year strategy, how much money do I expect to spend on an annual basis or fiscal basis in order to continue not only keeping DE&I going, but elevating it as I go through time. Adjustments made as we become more mature in the model. Additional staff augmentation and direct headcount labor costs required to support DE&I is always something good to keep tabs on. And what this means is proper planning is going to bring about the best return on investment. Under this recommendation, DE&I projected spend required to sustain the effort. It will ensure some good financial strength. It'll help show that the company is fiscally responsible with regard to its financial assets, while you're trying to ensure that measurable outcomes tied back to financial investment in the area of DE&I come back, and you can actually create the tie between the elements of DE&I, the culture, the business transformation, and how that money was spent and used wisely in this area. Again, as mentioned earlier in this presentation, we do have references for your consideration, for your reading, and certainly we are thankful for all those that have paved the way with their research. It is this research that has come together in order to provide for this presentation. This is the end of my presentation. Again, I'm Jonathan Cooper, and I appreciate your time in listening to the impact of the pandemic on DE&I as we attempt to move forward, hopefully to exit the pandemic sooner rather than later, so that companies and or other institutions can begin to solidify their plans to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion into that particular workforce or organization for the betterment of all, not just underrepresented groups, but for every employee, every person, every participant that takes a seat at the table. Thank you very much.